Welcome back to Media 7. We've been under no illusions as to what John Key's government doesn't want to see in broadcasting policy. Bye-bye TVNZ's charter. But we're still discovering what the government does want, and to that end I'm delighted to welcome the Minister of Broadcasting, Jonathan Coleman. Welcome, Minister.
Thanks, Russell.
Well, I'll start off the same way I started with the producers themselves. What did you make of Julie Christie's speech?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I've got the greatest respect for Julie and what she's achieved in the industry, and she's been a real pioneer, but that doesn't mean we agree on absolutely everything. I think she raised some very good points in that speech, but I think there's probably some differences of opinion between me and her.
What were the good points
well,
in the speech?
You know, she's identified that the industry has to really focus on becoming to a greater degree self-sufficient, that the answer's not always going to come in the form of more government funding, and that maybe it does necessitate a change of mindset. But where I would disagree with her is some of her thoughts around how NZ On Air money should essentially be spent, and she's really calling there for a rampantly commercial approach. You know, the government spends money on a lot of things that don't necessarily produce an economic return. And I think if you took her argument to its ultimate point, and she's saying, look, we've got to actually use the production industry to raise export earnings. If you really extrapolated that, you might say, well, should we be taking that money and putting it into some other industry altogether, which might raise export earnings even further, like tourism or maybe some area of scientific research. Now, I'm sure no one in the industry wants to do that. I don't want to do it either. And, you know, the reason we have NZ On Air is to make sure that we can get stuff on screen which wouldn't otherwise be made, and we can get New Zealand content on screen. That doesn't mean that that content is not necessarily going to be commercially successful. And indeed, NZ On Air funding's gone into a lot of commercially, or what you'd call essentially commercial New Zealand projects. You look at Outrageous Fortune, Go Girls, The Cult. So it's not mutually exclusive, but from what I saw of that speech, she is calling for a specific genre to be funded, and I think there's got to be a focus on getting quality New Zealand stuff on the screen. Now, what anyone's definition of quality is, well, we know that varies, but I'm happy with the way NZ On Air is functioning at the moment. I think it's doing a good job.
And that remains the philosophy that the government funds broadcast programming because in many cases otherwise those programs would not be made.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at what we've done with the Platinum Fund, we've taken that charter funding, we've put it up for competition through NZ On Air, and we've said there's some specific outcomes we want, and there's a number of genres which we're funding this year, which otherwise probably wouldn't be made. So, you know, it's quite clear. I know that when there's change, people do feel threatened, but we are committed to public broadcasting. We might just be delivering it a little bit differently to how it's been delivered in the past, but the money is...
Are you pleased with how the Platinum Fund has been operated in its first year? Is it going well?
Well, I think it's going pretty well. I mean, we've had a lot of good proposals. I mean, the proof of it's going to be over time, but, you know, there has been a lot of interest in it. I think the screen production industry, the feedback I've been getting, they've been pretty excited because it's no longer the case that you've got that broadcaster monopoly on that funding.
Another point that Julie Christie made in the speech was that there is, under the current model, there is a built-in insecurity for producers. I mean, John Barnett for sure, he can write Shortland Street at the top of his blank piece of paper at the beginning of every year. Everyone else is hoping that what they want to produce gets funded and gets screened. Is there any comfort you can offer to that industry in terms of, you know, they find it difficult to plan from year to year?
Well, the reality is the minister's arm's length from NZ On Air, so our job is to broadly set the policy, make sure the funding's available, but we don't interfere to that level. So those are really issues between the producers and the funder.
One area where, as I'm sure you'll know what I'm leading up to, where many ministers seem to have a hand in, was the rugby rights shambles. I think it's fair to call it that.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
What happened there, and what happened to the idea that this was a commercial negotiation that the government had no business in, because it seemed that everyone had business in it?
Yeah. Well, look, the first thing with the Rugby World Cup is, whether you like sport or not, it is going to be an extraordinary event. And look, it is going to be the biggest event that New Zealand puts on in our lifetimes. I mean, you know, that's a fact. So it's a bit more than just coverage of a few sports games. And I think it's pretty important that all New Zealanders can see those games. The government was always pretty keen on the idea of MTS being involved in that. But we had a view that we wanted to share the coverage around. Now, there's some political lessons in there for everyone involved, and I think those lessons have been learnt by people, and you know, it would take the rest of the slot to go through that. But you know, I think we learned some lessons, both us and our coalition partners, about communication. And in retrospect, some of those things would have been done differently by all partners. But look, ironically enough, we've actually got the outcome that the government was keen on in the first place, but it's gone round the houses getting there. You know, we've got 3 broadcasters involved. Everyone should be able to see it on free-to-air television, so I think that's a pretty good outcome for the public.
But I'm guessing the fact that the government did have quite a strong role here does not suggest that in future you may look at things like the anti-siphoning legislation, which you're often being called upon to look at.
Sure, yeah. No, we've been quite upfront that we're not in favour of anti-siphoning. There were some wider considerations with the Rugby World Cup, not the least of which is that the government carries the can for any liability. That liability, when we started, was $30 million. And there were advertising considerations, a whole lot of things rather than just where the games were seen, you know, and the taxpayer actually carries the can for that at the end of the day. So this was an extraordinary one-off television situation, and I think some lessons have been learned.
Another thing that they do across the Tasman
Yep.
that I think is quite well thought of here is the regulation that requires pay TV to put 10% of its revenue into local production, and I know that people feel that Sky should be off its own back doing that here. Is that something you would look at?
Well, it's not something that we've considered at this stage, but you know, we do want to have a vibrant local production industry. I mean, there are different options for, you know, making sure that that continues to thrive, but that is not a specific proposal we've been working on.
Another key thing in your portfolio is the transition to digital television.
Sure.
And there's been some movement here and answering some of the questions about it. 6 and 7 are now on Sky, and now Prime is on Freeview. How much of a role did you play in either of those decisions?
Well, I was always keen that that would take place, but they were essentially commercial decisions for all the players involved. So the major role was in getting Prime on Freeview, where there had been an impasse for quite some time. So I called all the commercial players involved to a meeting in Wellington, sat down and said, look, we would like to see this happen. We've got you guys in the room. Let's identify what the main barriers are. Those were identified. The key people went away and talked about them and came back, and they found that those hurdles weren't actually insurmountable, and now we do have Prime on Freeview, so it worked. But at the end of the day, it was up to those individual commercial entities to make that decision. If they just said, look, it's not going to work for us, you know, we couldn't force them to do it, but you know, I made it clear that that was something that we would be
right up until that decision was made, it
Yeah.
seemed that Sky was holding out for a better price to get on Freeview terrestrial. Did you or anyone else lean on Cordia to give Sky a better price or a sweetheart deal?
No, there was none, nothing like that on the government's part. No, that didn't happen.
How are we proceeding towards digital switchover? Are you happy with progress? Is there anything else needs to be done?
Oh, look, there's a heck of a lot of work that needs to be done, and this is going to be the major piece of work in broadcasting over the next couple of years. We've just been over to Australia recently to see where they're at. Now, they're switching over in 2013. They've got an independent unit within their ministry over there. They've got dozens of full-time staff. They're ramping that up even further. There's a lot of work to do, so it's not just a matter of setting a date. In terms of take-up levels, yeah, I think we're doing pretty well. You know, we're unofficially around the 60% level, maybe a bit over that. But there are some key questions to be answered, not least of which is the date, and issues around how we're going to get there, issues around, you know, to what extent the public are going to get there themselves and who's going to be left at the end, because there's no way we can switch over with people suddenly staring at a blank TV screen on the day. So, you know, we're looking at how
does that mean
that
New Plymouth and all those other places that don't get the DTT broadcast now will be brought in and the coverage will be extended?
Well, you know, I think there is going to be a demand for DTT. People are going to want high definition television. People are increasingly becoming aware of the technology. It's going to become far more widespread. So we are looking at options around that, but no firm decisions yet. But, you know, we recognise that there is going to be demand for new technology, and as we move to digital switchover, you know, that is going to be a consideration. Whether we've actually done the extension by the date of digital switchover, that's another issue, but these are definitely things we're talking about.
As I understand the plan for the carve-up of the frequencies that will be freed up once the digital switchover happens,
yeah,
Sky gets about half the new terrestrial frequencies. Why is that?
Well, look, we haven't made any decisions at all around that. We've had some consultation out there. The whole issue around carving up the spectrum, you know, it's going to be pretty complex. There's going to be a lot of demand and no final decisions have been made.
Do you think it's important to leave space there for new entrants? Because it would seem that if the current plan is what happens,
sure,
then there is no room for new entrants. Sky has potentially the kind of lock on terrestrial transmission that they have on satellite.
Well, you know, no decisions have been made yet, so what I would say is that we would like to see a competitive market and we would like to see space for that in the long term.
Now, the previous government provided funding for this channel and TVNZ6. You know, it was a key plank to incentivise people to shift to Freeview.
Yep.
We're halfway through that funding, roughly. What happens after that?
Well, look, 6 and 7 have been pretty successful and they're gaining viewers all the time. But there's not necessarily going to be extra new money available, and you know, being pretty upfront about that, I've said to TVNZ we've got to look at ways that these channels can become self-sustaining in the long term. Now that raises a whole lot of questions about how that occurs, but if you look at the broader financial environment that the government's in, there is not the capacity at the moment to get new funding for broadcasting, as there isn't in any other vote. So if we want new money for new initiatives, we've got to make savings elsewhere. Things are pretty tight across the broadcasting vote. So, you know, we are going to have to live within our means. And, you know, you talk about Australia before. If you look at the amount, for instance, that the ABC has, it has 10 times what we have in New Zealand for its radio operation, 10 times what we have for its TV operation, 5 times the population. So it's leveraged by a factor of 2. So, you know, there's no question we're pretty financially constrained here, and we're going to have to look at how we can make public broadcasting work. And that's going to require quite a bit of thinking. But you are talking about public broadcasting here, so you still see 6 and 7 as being, you know, even after that 5 years funding has expired, you still see them as being public broadcasting channels? Well, look, that I can't get too directive with TVNZ, but there's a range of ways you could cut it, and put it this way, I would not be unhappy if 6 and 7 continued as public broadcasting channels. Now, how you fund that, that's a different story, but I think that would be a desirable outcome.
Okay, last question,
Yep.
Quick question. Can you guarantee that the 5 years funding that has been promised, that is what will happen?
You know, you can never guarantee anything that the Minister of Finance has control over, because he has the final say-so, but there's been no talk of that funding being clipped. So I would fully expect that funding would be there for the full 5 years. The question marks are beyond that period.
Well, I think I've still got a job. Thank you, Minister.
Right, okay, thanks, Russell.
Broadcasting Minister Jonathan Coleman. Thanks also to John Barnett, Nick Murray, Jane Wrightson, Tainui Stevens, Paula Maxwell, and of course to you for watching. And that's our Sparta special. We'll be back with Media 7 from our regular venue next week. Until then, goodbye.